Hi, everyone.
Hi, Carmen.
Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome. It's great to see your faces in person. It's great to see so many people online as well. Thank you for joining. This is an event hosted by the Association of Engaged Buddhists. We are working to support the community of Buddhist practitioners. We have a non-sectarian approach, and we try to create support and community around all the different ways that people practice and the ways that Buddhist practice can be incorporated into life. And so it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Tucker Peck. Briefly, Tucker has made it over here from San Francisco Bay Area. He arrived yesterday and is battling through the jet lag. Tucker's been my teacher for a few years, and I found his teaching to be incredibly helpful, and I found him to be a really great source of inspiration and knowledge. So I'm so glad that he's here and able to share this with all of you in person. So I'll pass it on over.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I was saying a few minutes ago, I had planned a workshop in Sydney and a workshop in Melbourne nearly 3 years ago, and just kept delaying until, well, everything has to stop being on fire, and then we have to stop having COVID, and then everything has to stop being underwater. And there's been a brief pause in the apocalypse, and I've made it. I was also especially excited to be speaking to the Association of Engaged Buddhists, because I got engaged in August, and I just thought I would fit in perfectly. It is true that I got engaged. So I thought what we could do is we could start out with a meditation. Kind of let me know, we usually sit for 20 minutes here. Is 20 minutes going to be an unusually long time for anybody? No, I figured coming here, probably not. Okay. So I'm going to set a timer on my phone. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to guide you with some very standard meditation instructions. And then that will be the first thing we'll talk about is those instructions. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind turning your camera on, I'd love to see you. It has that nice, I don't know if you all felt this as well, that during the lockdown, there's plenty of time to meditate. And then after lockdown, when we could do it in community again, it felt so much better, It feels almost like this multiplier. 20 minutes in community is like an hour and a half alone at home. And so I like being able to see everybody. It feels like it builds the community, and it gives that nice peer pressure of if you get bored, you can't get up and walk away because we can see you. Let me set my timer here. And I'll ring this pretty bell we've got. We'll start the meditation by bringing the attention to the breath. And if you're new to meditation, just trying to keep the attention on the breath is exactly what you want to do. Same way when I first studied yoga, turned out there were many ways to bend your back, and I only knew one of them. There's many ways to move the mind. As you study more, as you practice more, you find them. So if this instruction makes any sense, there's a type of attention that makes the mind narrow. It blocks out things other than the breath. Feels like looking through a microscope. There's other type of attention that doesn't make the mind smaller. What it's going to feel like is, instead of narrowing in on the breath, let the mind go nice and wide. And then just like care about the breath, enjoy the breath, and it will pop right into the middle there. And if the second type of attention makes sense, you'll probably find it's much easier. And if it doesn't make sense, or your mind is not very compliant today, the narrowing type is fine too. Number one mistake I hear from early meditators is that they're trying to make the mind quiet. So as we sit focusing on the breath, we will not try to make the mind quiet. We'll let it be loud if it's loud, quiet if it's quiet. If it's thinking sane, peaceful, Buddhist-y thoughts, we'll let it do that. And if it's thinking relatively insane, off the wall, unhelpful, harmful thoughts, we'll let it keep doing that. So as we sit, we won't try to control the mind at all. The only thing we'll try to control is what is in the center. Try to put the breath back in the center. One nice thing about meditating in an urban environment like this, there's all these outside sounds. We'll hear traffic and other people. We'll hear the clock ticking in here. And these outside sounds can be so helpful. All we're trying to do is let go of things other than the breath. It's pretty hard to let go of your thoughts. You just really feel like they're important. They're about you. They're the truth of this moment. It's so easy to let go of the sound of the bus outside or of the clock. Every time we hear an outside sound, we'll treat it like a mindfulness bell. Every outside sound is a reminder of what's supposed to be in the center right now. And unless you're a very unusual sort of person, the breath is not staying in the center all of the time. You'll be distracted by outside sounds and feelings in your body, emotions, images, memories. And if you're like most people, the thing that will distract you far and away the most is talking to yourself in your head. tends to be this rambling monologue. And for a lot of my students, the most distracting sorts of thoughts are thoughts about meditation. I love this. This is great. I should do this style more. Wait, now I'm not focused on the breath. I'm terrible at this. I should never do this again. And on and on and on. So we'll take a special care to notice any thoughts about meditation as objects to especially drop. And dropping never means silencing. You'll find you'll actually get much more lost if you try to silence the thought. The same way we don't go out to Broadway over there and ask all the traffic to please stop. We don't have to go inside and ask all the thoughts to please stop. It's pretty easy to ignore the traffic. And what we practice here is actually treating the rest of the mind precisely like the traffic, precisely like the clock. And state of mind where we get stuck following the thought, since ancient times, has been called the monkey mind. The image is a monkey swinging from one branch to another to another. Notice how if for just 1 second the breath is in the center of your attention. It's a delightful second. The breath feels great. Notice the cool, peaceful, healing sensations, the in-breath, the warmth of the out-breath, the feeling of getting things out of the body that don't need to be in there anymore. Notice the stability, the predictability, the peace that comes from 1 second of focusing on the breath. The more we enjoy focusing on the breath, the more it will just show up in the center. My teacher used to talk about training a puppy. You know, if the puppy does something you don't like and you yell at it, it just learns to be afraid of you. Give it a treat for doing what you want. It learns very quickly. Find what's nice about the breath, and it'll just show up. One thing you might notice as the room gets fairly quiet, and as we do this longer, and the mind gets more focused on the breath, things get quieter in there. Of course, not all the time. For some of you, it's probably getting louder. But sometimes we actually find those parts of the mind that we practice ignoring stop projecting so much. And if it's happening that the meditation, the peacefulness of the room, are bringing up any nice feelings in your mind, it's okay to quickly, if you want, drop the breath and explore them. Maybe not even all that quickly, and then come back to the breath. So it's the same idea. And noticing how nice, pretty short amount of time focusing away from the monkey mind can feel. Makes it so much easier to keep doing it, to come back and back and back, as we get lost over and over. Oh, hi everyone. Welcome back. That felt great. It's still, been back from lockdown, at least in California for a while now, and it just feels so good still meditating with a group like a novelty. Um, so the topic of tonight's brief talk, and the topic I'm doing a weekend workshop in Melbourne next weekend on the off chance anyone loves this talk so much you want to come to Melbourne next weekend, is Dharma and psychology. So I've been a clinical psychologist for a long time, and the paths of Dharma and psychology turn out to be fairly different. I just gave you what I think are probably among the most standard instructions for meditation. I don't think anyone was shocked at anything we just did in that meditation. And what are you supposed to do with the content of your mind in meditation? Ignore it, right? I wrote down this quote. It comes from the Dhammapada, although this quote shows up all over the Pali Canon. The first part is actually in quotes itself. He abused me, he attacked me, he robbed me, end quote. Those who harbor such thoughts will never end their hatred. Imagine going to a therapist and saying, I have been abused. And the therapist saying, you shouldn't talk about that. You shouldn't even think about that, or your mind will never overcome hatred. This is inconceivable, right? In fact, this is entirely the opposite of the two approaches. The Buddha and I should say, I see the Heart Sutra on the wall over there. I know this is a non-sectarian group. The Dharma that I teach comes almost entirely from the Pali Canon, the Theravada, Dharma. And the Buddha famously says he teaches two things. Does anyone know what the two things are? Anyone online? Yeah, oh, but we can't hear the online people. But Vanxi, I'm just gonna trust you that you know this. Oh, can we hear? Just chat. Okay. Well, Vanxi knew it. The Buddha says I teach two things: dukkha and the end of dukkha. When somebody says to the Buddha, "What happened to you under that Bodhi tree there?" He describes it in a bunch of different ways. But what he most commonly says is, I notice these four things, these four noble truths. There's this truth of dukkha. It turns out there's all this stress, all this trouble, and there's one thing you do. There's one stupid thing, and you're doing it all the time. And all you need to do is stop doing this one stupid thing, and all the stress goes away. Who here has been on and if I can see you online, please raise your hand. Who here has been on a meditation retreat? Almost everybody. Who here has been meditating for at least 5 years? Wow, cool. So the original Buddhist texts, when they're translated into English, were translated using Christian words. So Sangha was originally translated as church. The word akusala, which we would now say is unskillful, unwholesome, unhelpful, was translated as sinful. Most of the translations got updated, but what's the translation we generally hear for dukkha? Suffering. Okay, we are in a very advanced group of practitioners here. Who has overcome suffering or feels like they're getting close? Interesting. Yeah, right. Maybe this, not this weekend, maybe next weekend. Come to Melbourne, that'll. So, the aim of the Dharma is, I think, to overcome stress. I think this is a quite good translation of dukkha. Stress is all the trouble you cause yourself because of your problems. And so in the Dharma, what you're trying to do is overcome stress by just not doing tanha. Tanha is a pretty challenging word to translate. It's second noble truth. Recently, I've been using the term stupid control. It's controlling things in stupid ways, right? You get angry. And it's like, I don't want to be angry. I'm a Buddhist. I'm a meditator. I'm not feeling this right now. And that's not how minds move, right? That's a stupid way of controlling things. We went to the beach today. We went out to Bondi and we did that long walk. They didn't warn me how long it was. About 2/3 of the way down, there's a hashtag that says bloody long walk. And they should have put it at the beginning. But we, in the city, it was pretty hot. We got to the beach. It wasn't hot. We had our swimsuits and we had no use for them. It's like, this isn't what I wanted. I'm on holiday, right? Ooh, that stupid control. The weather does not care what I think about it. So in Dharma, there is this dropping of the mind. Awakening, the route to the success in the Dharma, feels like a subtraction problem. And I think if all of you have been doing this for a while, you probably know just what I mean. As you meditate, there's just like less than there used to be. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, there's a lot of adding. Can I do this more? Get this thing? If I talk to students who are in, second year of meditation, it's like, okay, I can get to the second jhana. How do I get to the third one? What are the routes to the fourth one? My map has 19 stages. How do I get to stage 17? And when you talk to people who have been at this 10 years, it's like, I got stressed out at work today, but less stressed than I used to get. There's this subtraction. And where a lot of the subtraction comes from is the ignoring of the content, right? Exactly what we did there. And whether your thoughts are about traumatic things that happen in your past or irrelevant things that you might do tomorrow, we just drop. And I think I have recently taught my 50th residential retreat. The point being, I've done a lot of this. I've had over 1,000 people on retreat. And in the Pali Suttas, the description of progress on the path is that the suffering, the stress, just goes down and down and down as you meditate. I'm curious, has anybody experienced a linear decrease in stress as a function of meditation? Yeah, I thought I might get one or two. We just have one. Has anybody else found it's actually been more of a roller coaster? Yeah, that's what nearly everyone seems to find. When I was in grad school, I used to do scientific research on meditation, and we'll just use my hands as a visual aid here. The study was the amount that you meditate is on one axis here, and this axis is the negative emotion that you experience. And of course, our hypothesis was it goes like this. The more you meditate, the less negative emotion you have. And in fact, it goes like this. It goes down briefly, and then way up, and then down over time. There's this analogy that I use constantly. And the analogy is you live next to a pond, but it's not a beautiful pond. It's a terrible pond. It's filled with algae and mosquitoes, and it smells, and there's no opportunity to move. This is where you live. And the only implement you have to do anything about this pond is a bucket. So what do? I would venture there are probably two things you should do. One is get to work with that bucket. Two, get used to living next to a stinky pond, because you will be for a long time. This is how I tend to think about Dharma and psychology, the interplay. The Dharma is getting good at living next to the pond. The pond is your own insanity, and what not everyone, but I would say well over 90% of my students have had this similar path where there's this reduction in the stress, the reduction in the pain. And then you start noticing what this pond looks like. that the effective meditation, briefly, there's a sort of beginner's luck that comes in meditation. The people sort of running around saying, everybody should meditate. The cause of stress is simply non-meditation. And if only you meditated, you wouldn't have any of these problems. Did anybody have this phase early on where, yeah, where your friends are like, oh yeah, my girlfriend and I are having issues. You're like, look, man, you just gotta meditate, and then you won't mind that you have issues. And does anybody still talk that way? Whew, great. So it tends to be this beginner's luck where, right in the beginning, all of your psychology appears that it will kind of go away as you do your Dharma practice. And at least for us Westerners, it doesn't seem to at all. It gets louder, it gets more in your face. One of my students said, as you wade into the pond, you notice how much stinkier it is than you had previously noticed. So, one direction is getting good at living next to a stinky pond. The other direction is draining the pond, right? As you walk this path of draining the pond, this analogy of draining a pond with a bucket starts to feel spot on. I get the sense that quite a lot of you know what I'm talking about. On one hand, you have no idea how deep the pond is. The only thing you can say is very. But also, it's definitely getting lower. I was, years into meditation and started noticing some childhood trauma in my mind and how much it had warped everything, my whole life. I was viewing through this lens, crazy ways I was acting that seemed to me like perfectly sane ways to be acting at the time. And the meditation made this really apparent. It happened on a retreat. The teacher said, oh, you're doing really well with this non-self stuff. Let me give you a practice to have even less self. We'll talk about non-self a little bit towards the end. Got even less self, and this just exploded out. And so what I did was I spent maybe 2 years working with the content, and the pond is a lot lower. Things that used to be, oh, I would just hear about them, my mind would collapse. That feeling where there's just one thing that's true. There's one sense of self. It's just, this is reality right now. That feeling, right? When the mind gets really tight like that. And now it's like, I don't even remember why those things made me tight. So, when we look at the content, the first thing everybody tends to find, I was on this podcast one time, and it was a show. I was on something, and the host said, imagine you have a 15-second commercial that's going to be broadcast to all of humanity. What do you want to say? And I was like, oh, I need like 3 seconds. Your thoughts are lying to you in predictable ways. There's one thing I could tell everyone in the world. It wouldn't actually be meditation. At least for us Westerners. This, I think, is the most important psychological insight that we could have. Your thoughts are lying to you in predictable ways. One of these predictable ways is your thoughts are extreme. Thoughts are extreme. Does anybody ever find something doesn't go well, and your thoughts are like, you're a failure, loser, everybody here is upset with you? I'm seeing some nods, like I'm not it's not just me, right? Okay, great, because my thoughts were telling me it was just me. Your thoughts tend to be extreme in a way that reality just never is. I'm a professional extrovert. I know a lot of people. And people who are truly across the board a failure, I can't think of one. Be good at some things, bad at other things. Your thoughts will tell you that things are highly personal. I was working with somebody with a drinking problem. It was like, so we'll try strategy A. And if you try strategy A and you still find you're drinking, try strategy B, which is, more intense. And if that doesn't work, you try strategy C. And he kept saying, like, but this is punishing me. If I fail at A, I'm going to punish myself. Oh, no. This is one of the predictable ways your thoughts are lying to you. Your thoughts are extreme, and they make things out to be about you, right? When I would teach my intro meditation class, I'd say, okay, I'm going to assign homework for next week. I want you to look at the person to your left and imagine that next week they're going to come in and say, I was really busy and I didn't get to do my homework at all. What thoughts are going through your head? Oh, yeah, I understand busy, try harder next week. We've all been there. Okay, now imagine you come in and didn't do your homework. What thoughts are going through your head? I don't know you all well enough to list the expletives that seem likely to be going through your head. So they tend to be personal like that. And for whatever reason, at least nowadays in our culture, they seem to be incredibly cruel. The things that most of the people I talk to hear in their own heads all the time seem so cruel that if you said them out loud to a person you didn't like, everyone would assume you were joking. No one would ever say a thing out loud as cruel as what we hear in our head all the time, right? Imagine next week you come in and you didn't do your meditation homework. The thoughts are going to be like, you're a failure. Everyone's disappointed in you. This is what you always do. This is why your parents were disappointed in you when you were a kid. This is why you're now a failure as a parent yourself. Blah, 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 blah. So it surprised me as I was teaching retreats to find that, like, maybe a quarter. So I think probably most of the retreats you've been on would have a similar format where people come in and meet with me in the interviews. And in the interviews, it seemed like about a quarter of the time I was talking about topics that seemed pretty clearly related to Dharma, either philosophy of Dharma, things people are noticing in their own practice about the nature of mind, or meditation technique. It seemed that about 75% of the time, I was doing approximately the same job I was doing in my therapy career. It seemed that most of what was happening when people did large amounts of meditation was crying, talking about feelings, re-experiencing traumas. I teach a lot of 10-day retreats, and I would like to talk about the arc of the 10-day retreat. I say, imagine that I blindfolded you, brought you here and unblindfolded you, and you had to guess where you were. Day 1 and 2, you might guess you were on like a battlefield. People are so tired. It's just like bodies everywhere, people falling asleep anywhere they can. Days 3 and 4 would be really hard to guess. Your first guess might be like mental hospital, sort of like Pentecostal revival. There's a lot of crying and shaking and things like that. That it seemed that as people sat quietly, all of this intense visceral emotion, psychological stuff was coming out. And while often by the end of the 10 days, a lot of that had calmed down, I would see people year after year who were coming back with very similar sorts of issues. So I was a little nervous talking in a country I'd never been to before with a rather significant case of jet lag. But that's good. You want to show off how mindful and equanimous you can be. So it's after 1 o'clock in the morning in California, and I've walked 10 miles today. So meditation can do this to you too. I wrote all these notes and haven't yet consulted them. So before I talk about the interaction of Dharma and psychology, let me just see if there's anything on here I wanted to make sure that I told you about that I thus far haven't. Yeah, some of this stuff was good. Oh, it's a shame you all missed out on this. So one way I like to talk about Dharma with my students is talking about Dharma, talking about meditation as an anti-healing practice. I don't know if this is the same here in Sydney, but in California, most of my students are trying everything to feel less crazy. And that's a heavy burden, you know, the charge of the Dharma to become free of suffering, or at least freer of suffering. That's a heavy burden to carry around. And it starts to feel like a chore from which you never get any respite. So one distinction that I like to make between meditation and psychology is to think of meditation as a radical practice of anti-healing. Right? This is exactly what we did in these instructions I was just giving you. Oh, is your mind speaking sort of awful, hateful language? Just ignore it. And it turns out most of your problems will go away if you skillfully ignore them. And the adverbs are the important words in that sentence. For those of you who aren't great with grammar, there were two adverbs. Most, an irregular adverb, and it does not end in "ly," but that's not important. Most and skillfully. This is where the psychology part comes in. Some of these problems do not go away. And of course, it's a skillful ignoring, right? So what occurs, did anybody have in the 20-minute sit here that experience where some of the blah, 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 blah in your mind gets quieter as a function of sitting for 20 minutes? Yeah. So in Dharma, we call this pacification. Pacification is that tendency of phenomena to disappear as you ignore them. And the first pacification anybody will tend to notice is what many of us did. Your thoughts just get less rambly. And then pacification can become intense, you know, especially on retreat. The senses can actually turn off. You just sort of hear like a conch shell instead of sound, and you see a bright light instead of images. There's also what we call in Dharma purification. It's about the same as the psychology word catharsis. It's where it feels almost like the mental version of a massage, right? You go to get a massage and you go, oh yeah, it kind of hurts here. And then the massage therapist pushes on it and it hurts so much more. And then let go of it. And this pain has been there for a long time, is gone. So one type of ignoring it is this purification, letting it come up. Another type of ignoring it is this pacification, whereby ignoring it, it gets quiet. And then there's this wrong type of ignoring it, repression. Repression is the stupid control, right? Shut up, shut up, shut up. I'm a Buddhist. When you start seeing this repression in your meditation, it feels like, did anybody get when you were a kid and you misbehaved? Go to your room. It feels like you take the parts of your mind you don't really like, and you just put them in a room and lock the door and don't send any food in. So in the Dharma practice, with some exceptions, we are ignoring the mental content and we're focusing on the mental process, right? In the Dharma, we're looking at how the mind works. I spent years trying to get a good analogy for process versus content, and I got it. If you see a couple arguing, what you're gonna almost assuredly do is try to figure out who's right, you know? You're gonna weigh her argument against his argument, and it's quite hard to put your attention on the argument in some other way. Now imagine they're arguing in Dutch. Does anybody here speak Dutch? For some reason, many years ago, was teaching in the Netherlands and came up with this line that nobody speaks Dutch. I don't remember where that joke came from, but I've been repeating it for a long time. All right, let's do a bit of a deeper cut. Who knows Finnish? Great. So let's now imagine the couple is arguing in Finnish. Now, you can't try to weigh their arguments. You don't know what they're saying. What are you going to look at when a couple's arguing in Finnish? Well, okay, as he gets louder, she gets meeker. Until at some point she seems too meek and she springs, and then he becomes meek, right? You're going to watch how the couple argues if you can't watch the content of the argument. And it turns out it's almost impossible to see both of these at once. It turns out because you're focusing on my speech, you're focusing on the meaning, you're probably putting very little attention into the lilt in my voice, the way the volume is changing, things like that. And what you can do is learn to flip and watch the process of how do I communicate this information, which is what you'd be doing if I were speaking Finnish. I once knew like 4 words in Finnish. One of them wasn't helpful. It was the spruce, the word for a spruce tree in Finnish. Taught a few retreats in Finland. It's a very difficult language. So I make sure, especially in foreign countries, all my retreats are silent. So I have all these little mantras that I like to use with my students. And not meditative mantras, but pithy sayings to remind you of the teachings. And the one that I say the most is this core interactional principle that I like to think of between Dharma and psychology. It's what you should meditate on. Process when you can, and content when you have to. The reason I like this model is the lake is really deep. I've been teaching Dharma for a while, and so I've gotten to know, at least in America, I think most of the more senior meditation teachers, and there's certainly a lot of them more junior ones as well. And I just don't find people who say my mind behaves all the time, who say like I don't find issues when I look in there. And so you're going to be living next to the stinky lake at least for a very long time. I do think I knew one person who was enlightened in every sense of the word. She started meditation at the age of 40. Age of about 94 and a half, something happened that looked to me like the fullest definition of enlightenment. There was just nothing left but love, light, and eccentricity. She was a little old lady way out in the desert. And I went to visit her, and there were these like guys from a motorcycle gang there. And she said, oh, I met them in town. And I said, you love me. I'd like you to come over to my house and color. And, and they did. She appeared to have no remaining issues, and she was someone I knew very well. But, it happened a year before she died. So I don't mean to say at all that awakening isn't possible. I mean, I really think I've seen it. But I do mean to say, probably not soon. And so the process when you can is the idea of getting quite used to living next to this stinky pond because you're going to, right? I've, lost track of how many retreats I've done over the last, started sitting retreats 15 years ago. I've lost track of how many years and meditating for over 2 decades. And my emotional range is pretty large still. But from all the meditation, there are a few things that stay fairly constant. It has become very unusual for me to do a stupid thing on account of emotion. I mean, it happens. But if I get very angry, ooh, anger, I know that one, right? I have watched every angle of this. And even if my mind is collapsed around the anger, it's almost always easy to be like, there are no good ideas in here right now. Don't say or do anything. If you have to make a decision, call someone smart. Do what they tell you. So this is one of the big benefits you get from focusing on the process. The anger's still coming up for no reason, for stupid reasons. That thing where someone does some minor thing today and it reminds you of major things someone did 25 years ago. And that's stupid. Those things are not related. But the mind stays pretty crazy, right? Well into the path, the mind stays pretty crazy. Because focusing on process is getting good at having a crazy mind, getting good living next to a swamp. And this is a deeply attainable goal. When I asked who here felt like they were fairly close to overcoming suffering, I saw no hands. Maybe some of the people left their cameras off because they knew it was rude to out yourself as a Buddha, and so it was a safe way to do it. Has anyone here found that they've gotten much better at operating a mind that still has lots of suffering in it on account of their practice? Great. So this is the idea of focus on mental process when you can. It's really good for you. Focusing on content when you have to doesn't have any time limit. So focusing on process when you can and content when you have to could mean that every meditation for the next 10 years, the only thing you're going to do is focus on the content. Has anybody had these periods of your practice where like the same psychological stuff just comes up over and over and over? Cool, okay. Every time I do that, I'm just like, please, not only me. I'm so glad there were some hands. So this is what I'm thinking about as content when you have to. One way I would think about that is the same content is coming up over and over and over. It just feels like banging your head into a wall. And when you try to focus on process, you just fail. Either you just get distracted, or you make no progress over a long period of time. Another reason I'll find for myself where I have to focus on the content is my practice turns to mud. There'll be something so heavily on my mind that if I try to do anything other than focus on that, there's just a big soup of dopiness in there. And all I can do is swim in the dopey soup. And as soon as I turn towards the content, suddenly the soup is gone. Suddenly I can look at the content. There's this truth. There's this clarity in looking at that truth. In English, we use the word mindfulness essentially constantly, even outside of Dharma circles. I was boarding an airplane recently, and there was a plaque outside the jetway saying to please be mindful of other passengers. It's like, whoa, we really went overboard with bringing meditation into mainstream culture. The airline wants me to be mindful. But the Buddha doesn't usually just say the word sati, the Pali for mindfulness. There's usually this compound word, sati sampajana. Anybody besides kind of know it? So the sati is mindfulness. Sampajana is clear comprehension. And these are talked about sometimes like two wings of a bird. That if all we do is mindfulness, 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 you will be like a bird with one wing spinning around in circles. And I'd be surprised and disheartened to learn that I was the only person in the room whose meditation had sometimes felt like a bird flapping one wing. So you could think of mindfulness as moving farther from the mental content, right? And this can feel great. Thoughts, we don't care what they are, you know? They're over here, I'm over here. Where the mind is vast, thoughts are small. The clear comprehension is, in many ways, the opposite. It's moving close to the thoughts, knowing, okay, this feeling is anger. This feeling is lust. This feeling is sleepiness, like that. The Sampajana feels amazing. One of the practices that I'll use to work with content is just mindfulness of the body. Commonly, because probably most people are familiar with the teacher S.N. Goenka, right? Yeah. Who's done a Goenka retreat? Oh, I guess he's not so big in Australia. Yeah. I do, and it won't work here, but I do a great impression of S.N. Goenka. And any other retreat I go to, you know, around the world, it just kills when I when I do that because everybody's been on this. But I guess I don't need to explain to you how his body mindfulness is different. What you find is as you focus on the body, you'll find that emotions have a perfect one-to-one correlation with body sensation. And my doctor was actually from the College of Science. And one-to-one correlation, perfect correlation, we get, when you train in science, you get really wary of ever saying a thing like that. That's bordering on heresy. But I have yet to find any counterexample. Every emotion will show up somewhere in the body. And the body doesn't lie to you in quite the same way the mind does, right? You could certainly imagine, and probably most of us can remember rather than imagine, being sad, not knowing you were sad. Somebody else saying, you look pretty rough. You're like, yes, good on you. I think that's what they say here. When you're on retreat in particular, this might be easiest to notice, the sadness shows up kind of over here most of the time, right? There's like a black hole or an indentation, like a sucking, a darkness. And it's fairly easy to be sad and think you're not sad. It's very hard to feel like coldness in your chest and think it's not there, right? So if I find that people don't seem to have any clarity around the content, this is the first instruction I'll give people. Move through your body, part by part, in ways that make anatomical sense, meaning, look at your foot, your ankle, and it's strange that there's no word for the lower leg. It's the calf and the shin. Because this is all the thigh. That's not important. This is what in the Ashtanga and Kamalashila school of meditation would be called a gross distraction, completely forgetting what you're supposed to be doing. I didn't forget. It was a subtle distraction. I've still got the object right here. So cutting the body up in ways that make anatomical sense rather than, focusing on the stretch of your arm. And just observing what's happening. Particularly observing the torso above your belt, and probably about your belt up through your throat here. You'll get a lot of the content as you get sharper, focusing over here. And then the content's harder to miss. Probably a lot of folks are familiar with that term spiritual bypassing, yeah? And where you just, it's using Buddhist concept of emptiness as a vice, right? Oh, I had a teacher for a long time who said, I don't experience anger anymore. And, finish the Dharma talk and start snapping at me and calling me names. It's like, ooh, I experience your anger. What's wrong that you don't seem to? So this body mindfulness will overcome that tendency to skip the content, right? Too much mindfulness, you can actually miss all of the content. The body mindfulness will help you figure out what the content actually is. Another great practice, it's maybe my favorite, for people who are able to feel their emotions, who know what they're feeling. My favorite is a simple practice called emotion noting. Keep the attention sort of free-floating through the body. And about every 2 seconds, you just name the emotion that you're feeling. When you first start doing this, it seems that most of the time you will be naming negative emotions. So I did this for weeks every day. It was just, tired, cranky, angry, tired, like that. And then one day, I don't remember what it was, I'll say sad. I said sad. And it felt so good to just honestly name and acknowledge the mental content. And my whole mind and body relaxed. And then I really froze on the label. I was like, what the hell is that? I was like, ooh, relaxation? And ever since that moment, whenever I do the emotion noting, it's just one after another. It's it's a negative positive mixture. Ever since that one moment. It seems that for obvious reasons, the negative is what we've suppressed the most. It's under the most pressure, right? So it's going to bounce back the most when we start looking inside. This practice is so delightfully freeing, this practice of just feeling what you happen to be feeling right now. And it dovetails with this Buddhist idea of undoing the stupid control, right? I don't feel sad, that's stupid control. Sadness, that's what's arising right now. I don't control it. Let's it go. And then I have found in my practice, and there's many of my students, and I think maybe literally all of my colleagues, that there are some pieces of content that are too difficult to get through on your own. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say I don't know a Dharma teacher who hasn't spent a while in therapy. And again, this isn't what the ancient Pali texts tell us at all. The ancient Pali texts imply that by focusing on the process, the content essentially goes away. That enlightenment, that waking up actually removes the content. And this doesn't seem to be what we find. So if, there's certainly other practices that we could work with to look directly at the content. But if you find that you continue banging your head into the wall, this is where therapy works great. There are buckets and buckets and buckets of things that I have drained, that I've seen my patients drain, that I think are too hidden, too ugly, too, it feels like they have tentacles in 1,000 parts of your personality that need to be removed one at a time before you can actually look at the complex on its own. We have about 20 minutes left, and when people ask me what my school of Dharma is, I generally call my philosophy on Dharma student-centered teaching, meaning I try not to give lectures too much. If you come to my Dharma talks generally, it's all question and answer. So I'd love to know, and so for the folks online, if you have questions, write them in the sidebar, and I will be able to see them. Oh, which someone has already kindly written in the sidebar for us. And I find generally, if someone's willing to ask the first question, all the others just come. What's on anyone's mind? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Milos.
So yeah, you were talking about meditating on process and content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll repeat the question once Milos is done, so the folks on the internet can hear.
And so I think when you were talking about meditating on the content, it seemed it was oriented around observing and noting.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Generally, the question. So your question is, does focus on process mean noting, observing?
No, on the content, because I wasn't sure what you meant by whether meditating on the content was some form of addressing the content, or was still just meditation and letting it come.
That's a great question. Yeah, the question is, does focusing on the content involve actually just knowing what the content is and letting it go? The short answer is yes. The long answer is no. Because there was a Christian meditator from, I think, like the 15th century called Saint Teresa de Avila. Has anyone read Teresa de Avila? She talks about the mind as being a castle. And the first story of the castle, she says, is 1,000 rooms. And each room is filled with different sorts of obstacles. This room is filled with vipers and so on. And I think this is a great metaphor for the pond, the sorts of content that we find. The content is quite varied. So a lot of the psychological issues that come up in practice, actually, if we name them, acknowledge them, so it's different from what we're often doing in Dharma, where we're simply letting go. Either letting go by focusing on the breath. In Mahasi style practice, we let go by just name it, let go, name it, let go, name it, let go. In the Shikantaza Zazen style, we just sort of make the mind bigger and relax the attention. But there's all these ways of not engaging with the content at all, right? So one thing that will often help move the content through is just name it. I think we've all experienced this, right? To just say, I feel sad. Actually feels great. This weird thing where I often leave funerals feeling kind of like great. Something where you can just be like, we're super sad right now. Something feels great about going to a place where you can be really sad. Just let it happen. Right? Other areas of content are going to be much trickier. So I gave the example of going to see a therapist. Some things you might do there's a Tibetan practice. It's an American nun in a Tibetan lineage has taken the Tibetan Chode practice and turned into something called feeding your demons. And it's an imagery practice where you take the emotions and you imagine them as characters and you work directly with the characters. There's another Tibetan practice where what you do is actually amp up the feeling of the emotion to get it louder and louder, such you see the content that way. So there are a variety of practices both in meditation and outside, in certainly most of the practice and therapy realm, where you're not just naming the content, you're actually working through and trying to heal the content. The idea is to go as little into it as you can, and as little into it as you can might be 3 therapy sessions a week for 2 years. What else is on anybody's mind? Oh, did I answer your question, Milosh?
Yeah,
Awesome.
I mean, I had another one, but I'll go. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's give it a minute, see if we get any other hands or a text. You know, if you give talks to non-meditators, like 2 seconds of silence and someone will ask a question, meditators can just sit there. Milosh!
Yeah, so in that metaphor or analogy that you used, being next to the stinky lake, and you're saying, get to work on the bucket, but also get used to, being next to the stinky lake. Is the bucket in this analogy psychology?
Yeah, the bucket is healing the content. Yeah. And where I think that analogy works nicely is I've had a bunch of retreats where I come out feeling like now I'm good, like I solved the big issue of my life and I'm gonna be happy and peaceful now. And 2 days later, it turns out that was not how it all worked out. The idea of the bucket is just there's so much distortion, so many knots in the mind that it's just referencing how you deal with one issue and there's 80,000 more in there. Feels like draining the pond with the bucket.
But as a tool, you're not sort of saying it's Dharma or psychology. It could be a mix of both. Like a bucket doesn't have to be one or the other.
Oh, no. So here, largely, I'm making this imperfect distinction of Dharma as leave it be, ignore it, focus just on process. It's an imperfect distinction, right? So even in the Theravada Dharma, we'll do metta practice or the Brahma Vihara practice, which is trying to deliberately create more positive emotions. The 6th of the Eightfold Path is right effort, which is specifically about trying to get rid of all these akusala, sinful things in your mind and bring in the good ones. And certainly, your psychologist telling you to let something be, to stop trying to control would not be a weird thing to hear. So the distinction is, as comparing to large, complex Dharma being millennia old, psychology being centuries old, any cut point is going to be totally wrong. But as sort of a stereotype, I'm thinking of Dharma as leave it alone and psychology as look into it. And that's what I'm using the bucket as, the looking into it, healing it. Yes, it's taking the content and trying to heal it, trying to get it out. Yeah. Yeah, please, Richard.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you said about emotion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, wouldn't is it a problem if you have difficulty noting, and are there any resources?
Yeah, so you could think of being too far from the emotions or too close, right? Too close. In San Francisco, that one's pretty common, being too close to the emotions. It's like, every time you have a feeling The party, sorry?
At art schools too.
Art school, yes, art schools. Every time you have a feeling, you know, the party must stop. Everyone must know. It must be talked through. You know, this is getting too close. It's what in Buddhism we call a total deficit of equanimity, right? You think of equanimity as like the size of your boat. And if you're on one of those big harbor ferries, it can be pretty rough out there and your boat's staying pretty stable, right? And if you're out there in a kayak, tiny little wave, anything is going to throw you and make you seasick. So we could think of this case where the equanimity is too low, where you're just too close to the emotions. And in this, what we really want to do is practices like shikantaza, zazen, things where the mind gets bigger. If you can't feel the emotions, for most people, I think almost everybody, that's going to be obstruction in Dharma practice. The teacher that I studied with for the longest wrote a book called The Mind Illuminated. Are folks familiar with that book here? A few people? The Mind Illuminated basically says if you focus on your breath hard enough, your psychology will evaporate. Fake news became a catchphrase in my country that fortunately spread very quickly to all of the other countries. And so what I would constantly see with people using that sort of modality is they could get, it's a 10-stage model. You know, if you get into maybe the 4th stage, early 5th stage, and then freeze, that the meditative progress would be obstructed by an inability to feel emotion. The thing I would always start people with who can't feel emotions very clearly is that instruction of just feel the body in usual anatomical ways. You know, what does your chest feel like? What does the top feel like? The bottom of the chest? What does it feel like halfway in between your chest and your back? I just put people on a body scanning diet. And for the vast majority of people that I've worked with, the emotions will start showing up because you'll find when you first look at your body, pressure is the easiest thing. So you'll feel what your body feels like against a chair. Clothing is probably number 2. And as you sit longer, you start feeling these things that are deeper inside the body, and they don't have real names that go along with them. But they're like expansion, contraction, tension, relaxation, pain, even though your body's not injured, things like that. So it's just sharpening the body will for most people get you this. And that's the direction I would start out in. Conveniently, we're about to do 4 days of meditation starting tomorrow. So a lot of time to scan your body. I've got a question from Fonxie over here, who we will all have to assume correctly answered my Dharma trivia question from before, so congratulations. Has the Dhamma had any impact on mainstream psychology? Oh, God. So I applied to graduate school in 2007, and my resume was quite good. And I was rejected from 27 grad schools over the course of 2 years. My application said, I want to be a psychologist who studies meditation. And 27, I applied to some lousy grad programs, you know, just to make sure I got in somewhere. I can tell you the names of some of them, but you've never heard of them. And they rejected me. And I would get this feedback of like, being a meditating psychologist is not a career, you know, that's not a thing. So you can't do that. Don't ever call this number again. And when I applied to residency in like 2014, I felt like one of the popular kids in school, you know? It's like, oh my God, you do meditation? Yeah, what can we give you? It's suddenly become hard to find psychologists who don't meditate. I used to run a psychotherapy training program, and one of my first interns was a devout Catholic. And he said, in my therapy training program, you know, when I mention Catholicism, people smile and nod and validate my diversity and other sort of patronizing things. And when somebody mentions Buddhism, it's the equivalent of mentioning science. You know, if the Buddha said it, it is epistemically valid in psychotherapy. So in psychology, the term for what I would largely call the Buddhist influence is called third wave psychotherapy. I think the first wave was psychodynamic, the second wave was behavioral. That might be wrong, but the third wave is largely the Dharma influence of not trying to change things. So there are a bunch of schools of psychotherapy that came out of this. Dialectical behavior therapy is a common one, particularly for people with severe emotion dysregulation, like borderline personality. It's the treatment of choice. And that was developed by a professor called Marshall Linehan, who was a Zen Buddhist. Mindfulness-based stress reduction came from, probably most people know the name, Jon Kabat-Zinn. It was then rebranded as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. There's this really funny thing where most medical doctors are under the impression that cognitive behavioral therapy is scientifically validated, unlike other forms of therapy. And therefore, if you yourself are if they're sending their patients to a therapist, they want to make sure that they're getting cognitive therapy because this is empirically supported. And nothing about this is true. But the myth is just deeply there. So the trick is, when you create some new school of therapy, put cognitive in the name. so they updated it to mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy has kind of taken the field by storm. So yeah, the impact has been pretty tremendous. So the impact on psychology of Dharma was shock and awe campaign, right? And in the course of just 5 or 6 years, it went from like, you meditate, get out of here. My first year of graduate school, we read a research paper on pseudoscience. And there was one paragraph where it talked about something so bogus that it didn't even qualify as pseudoscience. It was below pseudoscience. It said, oh, that total nonsense, like people who look for Bigfoot or practice meditation. And yeah, suddenly meditating psychologists, just go anywhere in the world and people will show up to my talks. Can't get into grad school. Something very popular. The reverse impact, I think, is very new and slow. The impact of psychology on Dharma. This will be a great topic to close on, too. I don't find any Pali texts that say what happens when you meditate is you notice how crazy you are. You come face to face with all of your issues and traumas and have to work through them. And I've heard so many stories of people studying with more traditionally trained teachers and having disastrous outcomes because of the ignoring of content. That in a lot of Dharma traditions, there is this one-size-fits-all approach, where if the technique seems to be psychologically damaging to you, do the technique more. Perhaps you're doing it wrong. Perhaps you're the wrong kind of person. When I first started teaching, everybody who would show up to my classes was basically, and there were a few books, largely The Mind Illuminated, and one called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. They had gotten very popular and were promising these totally fake timelines of, you'll be a Buddha by Christmas if you follow these simple instructions here. Only 1995, act now, and we'll throw in a tote bag. That when I first started teaching, everyone who showed up to my classes seemed to be convinced that your psychology would evaporate if you did good enough Dharma practice and just tried harder and tried harder. And that's the opposite of Dharma, right? Dharma is about like taking that little tiny part of the mind that thinks it's in charge, thinks it's the only part of the mind, and stopping, right? So I think that's one of the big impacts that I've seen of psychology on Dharma, is nowadays my students come in a lot more savvy about this will not lead to a rapid end of suffering. In fact, this can lead to quite an increase in suffering in the short term. What we're looking for is awareness, like learning more about how the mind works. Getting a better Tucker user manual is one of the things I think of as my goal for meditation, right? Troubleshooting guide. Is your Tucker feeling angry? Is he having trouble controlling the anger? Is there no apparent reason for the anger? Troubleshoot number 1. Has your Tucker eaten recently? Try giving it calories. If this does not work, right? And it sounds silly, but I didn't realize that before. What I don't know why the poly map doesn't seem to work. One easy explanation would be the Buddha is largely teaching like Nepali farmers who have very simple lives, right? Who also come from very intact social and family structures. And it makes sense that our psychology doesn't look very similar to theirs. But I think one great impact of psychology on Dharma is starting to happen and will continue. That Dharma will be a little less one size fits all. There was this buzz phrase, there's a book by David Treleaven called Trauma Informed Mindfulness. I think that's probably one good direction we'll go in. Another is when I've heard of students being injured by meditation, which seems to be, has anybody seen people get kind of hurt by the practice? Oh, that's lucky. Often the teachers wind up sort of blaming the students, like you didn't do it right or you're the wrong sort of person. I screen for mental illness when people come to my retreats, but I actually don't think I've ever excluded someone from mental illness. I just kind of tailor it towards them. So I'm actually working on a book. It's about halfway done on meditation and psychology. So I'm not here to pitch that book because it does not exist, and so you cannot buy it. But this is one of the things that I put there. So I think maybe it's a one thing kind of knows about me is I'm ruthlessly punctual, and we've just finished talking about the impact going forward of psychology and Dharma and psychology, and it is 8:59. So there's a Pali term, siddhi. And is anybody familiar with the term siddhi? It's a thing you can cultivate during meditation. And yes, it's a supernatural power you can cultivate during meditation. Mine is punctuality. That's right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. This has been terrifically fun. So my email address is my name. It's just tuckerpeck@gmail.com. So I do teach classes online. I teach retreats online. About once a year, I teach with another guy from California called Michael Taft. We do a virtual retreat. So if you all wanted to stay in touch, do anything I'm doing online, I don't know how soon I'll be back in Australia. It turns out this is just not very close to my house. And, on the map, it's hard to tell, but when you go from the train to the other train to the plane to the next plane, and then like a whole day disappears as you cross the date line, you realize this has to be a sometimes activity. But if you wanted to keep in touch online, you can email tuckerpeck@gmail.com. If you Google my name, the top hit will be my website, and that will list all of my retreats. You can sign up for my website. You can sign up for my listserv on there so that you'll get notified about stuff that I'm doing. And thanks so much for coming.